Good morning and welcome to Western Hills. We're glad that you are here. Man, y'all got to do a little bit better than that. Good morning, welcome to Western Hills. All right. It is Super Bowl Sunday. I know that you are excited about that. I'd like for you to just take just a moment, turn to somebody next to you, tell them who you think is going to win, and if you don't care, just say, I don't really care. Go ahead. Some of you may not even know who's playing in the Super Bowl. That is a shame. But anyway, we are glad we are going to have a great Super Bowl party here tonight. Starts at 5 o'clock. You'll be able to watch the game in here at the big screens. We will also have a Rook tournament as well. Scott and I think, like I said, our record from last year was 87-4. So that was pretty good. Now, granted, most of those games were played at Emeritus. So we beat a lot of people over there. But anyway, we love those folks. But we are glad that you're here today. Today we're going to continue our series on God is Bigger. God is bigger. Now, last week was a very interesting week. I got my workout with the 8 chairs. I put someone in the grave. I raised them up. Just want to let you know that people did go visit Bernice Lawson. She is alive. So that was just a big mess. Just a big mess. But we're glad Miss Bernice is good and doing well. Today, God is bigger. We've been looking at this series because we all go through tough stuff in life. Every one of us goes through tough stuff. And we have to have the conviction and the confidence that someone is bigger than the stuff that we're going through. And so in this series, we've been talking about how God is that bigger force. That He's bigger than our sufferings. He's bigger than evil. He's bigger than our religion. He's bigger than impossibilities. He's bigger than our past. He's bigger than our future. Today, we want to look at something called God is bigger than my present, than the stuff that I'm going through. We're all going through difficult times. And I heard about a letter that a college student wrote to her parents. I kind of don't want to read this because I don't want to give anybody ideas about stuff, but I'm going to go ahead and do this anyway. I'm the preacher, so I can get away with things like this. She writes this letter to her mom and dad, and here's how it goes. Dear Mom and Dad, it has now been 3 months since I left for college. I'm sorry for my thoughtlessness and not having written before. I will bring you up to date. But before you read, you had better sit down. Okay. I'm getting along pretty well now. The skull fracture and concussion I got when I jumped out of my apartment window when it caught fire after my arrival here is pretty well healed. I only spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and now I can see almost normally and only get these sick headaches once a day. Fortunately, the fire and my jump were witnessed by Roger, an attendant at the gas station. He's the one who called the fire department. He also visited me in the hospital. And since I had nowhere to live, he was kind enough to invite me to share his apartment with him. He's a very fine man. He dropped out of high school in the 10th grade to start working at the gas station, and we are planning to get married. We haven't set the date yet, but it will be before my pregnancy begins to show. His divorce is final now, and he shares custody of his 3 children. She goes on the second page. Now that I brought you up to date, I want to tell you that there was no fire. I did not have a concussion or skull fracture. I was not in the hospital. I'm not pregnant. I'm not engaged, and there is no man in my life. However, I am getting a D in art and an F in biology. And I just wanted you to see these marks in the proper perspective. Your loving daughter, Jane. So, it's very important that we do not take that to heart. Do not try to do anything. Hendrick, do not do that to your mama, all right, when you go off to college. It's very important. Now, we all look at things in a different perspective. Sometimes we look at God through our circumstances. Sometimes we look at our circumstances through God. If we use our circumstances as the filter to look at God, we often see God as someone who's inactive, someone who's not strong enough, someone who's not good enough, someone that doesn't love us. I mean, if I'm in this big mess that I'm in, why hasn't God delivered me? Why doesn't God move in my life? Why doesn't God take care of that? Why doesn't God get rid of that? And we just wonder ourselves, why and where is God in my life? But then sometimes, if we have a different perspective and we look at our circumstances through God, we look at the stuff that we're going through and we say, you know what? I don't know why I'm going through this. This really stinks. It hurts. It's not good. But I know that God has got my back. In fact, I know that God is bigger. And somehow, some way, God is going to do something in my life and work this stuff out for the good. Now, we all love a good story or a good movie. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to think with me. I want you to think of some of your favorite movies or a favorite story, favorite book, whatever it is. I want you to think of that. Okay, you got it in your head. Favorite movie, favorite story. I want to get a little audience participation today. This is always scary when I do this. I only do it like twice a year. So if you have got a favorite movie right now, raise your hand and I will come to you. Susie Shockley. Courageous, all right. Roger Henderson. The Fugitive. All right. The Harrison Ford one. Okay. Steve Goad. Forrest Gump. All right. Lori. Grease. All right. It's one of John's favorite, the hair tonic. But anyway, Billy. Pale Rider? All right. Well, we all love good stories and good movies. And what makes a good movie are the twists and turns that movies take. It's the unpredictability. I mean, you don't want to go to a movie and read the spoiler before you get there. It's one of those things, if you find out if someone has seen the movie, you tell them what? Don't tell me. Please don't tell me. I mean, I want to find out for my own. I want to go to the movie and watch the movie for myself. I want to experience the twists, the turns, the ups, the downs, the wins, the defeats. Please don't tell me how the movie ends. I want to experience that. That's what makes a great movie. However, life is completely different. If you're like me, I prefer my life to be an easy read. I prefer no twists, no turns, no conflicts, no problems. I want a story in my life that's smooth sailing. I don't want the ups and the downs. I prefer just something very stable. And here's the thing about life. It's not if we're going to have difficult circumstances, but it's when we're going to have difficult circumstances. Life is tough, and the church said it is very tough. And when the tough times do come, that's when what is revealed is who is really bigger. Now, there's a man that we want to put up on the screen. Some of you may know who this is. But about 4 or 5 years ago, the Buffalo Bills were playing the Pittsburgh Steelers. It was an extremely important game for the Buffalo Bills to win. Extremely important. It was a tough game, back and forth. It went into overtime. And this wide receiver by the name of Steven Johnson was having a pretty decent day. In overtime, he made it to the end zone. The ball was thrown by his quarterback, Fitzpatrick, and it hit Steven Johnson square in the hands. I mean, it couldn't have been any easier to catch. And Steven Johnson drops the ball. The Steelers get the ball back, and guess what happens? The Steelers win. The Bills no longer have a winning season. But that's not what we know Steven Johnson for. We know him because of his tweet. Steven Johnson says this: I praise you 24/7, and this is how you do me? You expect me to learn from this? How? I'll never forget this, ever. Thanks, though. He makes this tweet out to God, and it becomes kind of a big deal. Because this guy, Steven Johnson, blames God for him not catching the touchdown pass. And he says, I have praised you 24/7. I'm committed to you. I obey you. I'm faithful to you. And this is what happens when everything is on the line, when I have a chance to score the game-winning touchdown, and you let me down? I mean, what am I supposed to do with this? And I really think that a lot of Christians, and including me sometimes, we think that we are entitled to touchdown catches, home run hits, and game-winning shots. We think we're entitled to good health and pay raises. We're entitled to easy marriages and perfect children. That just isn't true. Life is tough. Life is hard, and life is unfair. And I'll just tell you that a lot of us, in fact, every one of us, are going to have terrible, horrible, no good, bad days. That's just what's going to happen. Jesus says it a little bit more eloquently in John chapter 16, verse 33. This is right before he goes to the cross. He says, I've told you these things so that in me you will have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Jesus says to his apostles, you are going to have trouble. Then in Matthew chapter 6 on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this, therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. I mean, Jesus says the exact same thing that we just talked about in that children's book, that all of us are going to have terrible, horrible, no good, very bad days. And that's when it gets extremely difficult. And what's really tough is when we begin to compare our troubles to other people's troubles. Where I say, well, he doesn't have it as bad as I do, or she's got it all together. You know, you've never walked in anybody's shoes. You've never lived in their world. Everybody has troubles. Everybody struggles with things. If you got your Bible, we're going to look at a story that normally we just kind of pass over. It's in the book of Acts. Acts chapters 27 and 28. It's the very end. It's a story that we kind of skip through. We love the Acts chapter 8s, the Acts 4s, the Acts 10s, the Acts 16s, but the Acts 27 and 28 we don't talk a whole lot about. It's an odd little story about Paul. Here's kind of the setup of it. Paul has been in prison 2 years. He's been in prison unjustly, unfairly. Should not have been there. Been there for 2 years. All right? Can you imagine that? Being put in jail in the prime of your life. And you didn't deserve to be there. You didn't do the crime. And you're in jail for 2 years. Paul had appealed, to the courts about getting him out. There was no evidence to cause his guilt, and there was no courage to set him free. So for 2 years, Paul was stuck in a prison that he didn't belong. Well, all of a sudden, the good news comes that he's going to get to go to Caesar and go before Caesar and plead his case. So he gets on, and this is where the story picks up. Let's begin in Acts chapter 27. Let's begin in verse 9. Acts 27, verse 9. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and to cargo, into our own lives also. Verse 11. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. So they kept sailing. They get on the ship. Paul's been in prison for 2 years. They get on the ship. Paul says, this ain't going to turn out very good. This is going to be a USS Minnow experience. This ain't going to be good. Ain't the Love Boat. And so Paul is warning them. It's going to get dangerous, but yet they keep moving on. And here's what happens, verse 14. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the Northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. And so there's this storm that comes up, a hurricane storm on a ship, where Paul said, this ain't going to turn out too good. Let's pick up the story, verse 20 of Acts 27. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, you should have took my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. That probably wasn't the best thing for him to say. Verse 22, But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men. For I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So here we are. A ship full of pagan sailors in the middle of a hurricane storm. So bad, I don't know if you've ever been seasick, but so bad that you could not eat. So bad that you thought you were going to die. And this preacher, this rabbi stands up and preaches to you. The times that you want to hear a sermon, that is not it. Go ahead and say amen. That's what I thought. Verse 27. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. So Paul has been in prison for 2 years. He's been on a ship in the middle of a hurricane for 2 weeks, sick as a dog, when they're about to hit land. And here's what happens, beginning in verse 33. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and he began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So, here we are on a ship, 276 people. Of those 276, probably only 2 of them were Christians. Luke, who was doing the writing, and Paul, who was doing the preaching. And then 274 pagan sailors about to be shipwrecked. And so they hit this island, and we pick up the story in chapter 28. Because then it gets even crazier. Once safely on shore, we find out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, This man must be a murderer. For though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. And this is a wild verse. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. And then, another twist in the story. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and for 3 days entertained us hospitably. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and they were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies that we needed. Now, quick review. No one in their right mind would want that story. 2 years in prison, unfairly. 2 weeks on a ship, seasick as a dog in the middle of a hurricane. 3 months on an island that you've never been to. Bit by a snake. Said it bit him on the hand. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the pain of that? Bit him on the hand so much that it says in the text that Paul shook it off into the fire. But throughout the entire story, all Paul could do was give thanks to God and preach. So we've got 3 really quick and simple points, because we're all in a story. Point number 1, just very simple. A great story has to have twists to take it where it needs to go. Every great story, every good book, every movie has to have those unpredictable twists and turns. When you read the story in Acts 27 and 28, there are twists and turns everywhere. I mean, Paul's doing this. He's going there. He's in prison. He's on the ship. He gets bit by a snake. He's on the island for 3 months. It's constant. It's just constant movement. And what's interesting is there are not only just twists and turns in the story in Paul, but there's also miracles everywhere. There's angels, there's prophecies, there's healings. But yet, think about this. None of those miracles really delivered Paul from the story that he was in. The story continued. He stayed in a prison for 2 years. He was on a ship for 2 weeks in a hurricane. He was on an island for 3 months. The miracles never changed the story. Instead, Paul had a chance to have a pulpit in the middle of a ship and on an island he'd never been to. He witnessed before a ship full of pagan sailors, and he witnessed to an island full of people who had never heard about the gospel of Jesus Christ. I don't know about you, I don't plan obstacles in my story, right? I mean, I don't plan on cancer. I don't plan on financial ruin. I don't plan on things not going my way. They just seem to happen. I seem to get twists and turns all the time in my life. It just seems like they just come out, and I'm like, how did I get here? Why is this happening to me? Paul says, I'll take the twists and turns and turn them into a pulpit. I wonder how many of us are willing to look at closed doors as divine detours. How many of us are willing to say, God's going to do something right now? God can work through even the nastiest situations. God can work through divorces. God can work through addictions. God can work through that health condition that you have that you didn't ask for. God can move. Did you know that the book of Galatians would not have been written if it wasn't for this? As you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. Let that sink in. Paul writes to the Galatian church and he says, by the way, guys, I would have never preached to you if I hadn't got sick. So I want you to think with me. How has God used your difficult circumstance? Have you ever seen God move in your life and say, you know, if that hadn't happened to me, I wouldn't have been here? I mean, it's not about where you want to go, but it's about where you need to be. I don't know if you know the story about my journey as a preacher, but in the year 1999, I finally graduated from Lipscomb. It took me almost a decade to graduate from college. I finally graduated. Started looking for a full-time job. We went to a lot of different places. We had several different offers. We had a couple that we were like, there's no way we're going to. There was one church down in Alabama that refused to reach out to a trailer park, and I thought, this ain't my kind of church. We went to lots of different places, and we found this church in Columbus, Ohio, that I said, you know what? That's where we're gonna be. We went up there a couple times. It worked out. The last Sunday that I went up there to try out, they called me on that. No, actually, they offered me the job that Sunday afternoon. I shook their hand and took it. We went back to Nashville Monday morning. In the middle of West Nashville, by West Park, I got a phone call from another church in Kailua, Hawaii. Brother David, we'd love to fly you out here and take a good look at you. I'm thinking, are you serious? Kailua, Hawaii? Columbus, Ohio? I mean, 3 feet of snow on the ground or a pig in the ground? I mean, I'm thinking, what is going on? Well, I couldn't renege. I mean, we took the free trip anyway, right? Just kidding, Susie. We didn't do that. But I said, no, thank you, I can't do that. We went up to Columbus, Ohio. If I had gone to Kailua, Hawaii, things would have gotten really difficult for us. We went up to Ohio in 2000. In 2002, my dad got extremely sick. The Hillwood Body Shop over in West Nashville called me, said, David, your dad is in the middle of Charlotte Pike driving his ship. He'd gotten off his medicine, and he was driving his POW transport ship in the Korean War in the middle of Charlotte Pike. And there was no one else that could have taken care of my dad. My 2 sisters were unable to. They just couldn't do it. If I had been in Kailua, Hawaii, it would have made things very difficult. Took care of my folks, sold the property, moved them into Villa Maria, moved my dad into a VA rest home. I was able to do that because I was only 6 hours away, not halfway across the world. 2004, my dad gets lung cancer and colon cancer, and he passes away. 2005, my sister has colon cancer. She passes away. I have 2 deaths on my hands in 2 years. If I was in Hawaii, it would have been very difficult, but I was in Ohio. A lot easier. 2006, Yes finally called me and said, we want you to come and be the West Nashville Center Director. The reason why you're going to be the West Nashville Center Director is because you were a kid that grew up in West Nashville. You were poor as dirt, and you grew up in a rough home, and you didn't have nothing, and we got to have somebody that had nothing who's got something to talk to these West Nashville kids. I grew up in a bad home, circumstances that were unfair, but God used those circumstances to be a pulpit in West Nashville. I moved back here in Nashville in 2006. My mama got sick. She had strokes. She passed away. But I was here for her last few days. I worked at Yes for the next 8 or 9 years. I placed membership here, and now I'm the full-time preacher. None of that would have happened if God didn't take twists and turns. A great story needs twists and turns to take it where it needs to be. So the question is right now, at this very moment, what kind of twist or turn are you in? And if you're in one, the question is not when is God going to take it away. The question is what is God going to do with it? How is he going to use it? Paul, all he could do was preach about it. Now, here's another thing about a great story. A great story has hard chapters to develop the main character. I mean, you want to see in a good story or a good movie, you want to see that good guy go through difficult things. I mean, we went to go see the Star Wars movie back in December because you wanted to see what Han Solo was like. You wanted to see Chewbacca. You wanted to see Princess Leia. You wanted to see Luke Skywalker, those people that you grew up with, and you wanted to see what had happened to them, the twists and the turns, and you waited. At least that's what I did. I waited in that movie theater, waiting to see what is going on with Luke Skywalker. You watch the Rocky Balboas because you know that Rocky in the middle of the story is going to have his back against the wall. He's going to be the ultimate underdog. He's going to lose the match. But yet you just wait for those hard chapters because you know they develop the main character. Die Hard wouldn't be a great movie if John McClane didn't walk through a floor filled with glass. And same thing with us. Hard chapters are inevitable, but hard chapters are indispensable because they're going to do something. Romans chapter 5, Paul says it like this: Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we gain access by faith into this grace into which we now stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. We know that those bad times, those difficult circumstances will develop character. James 1, 2 and 3 in the NIV says it like this: Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. The Message says it kind of like this. Throw it up there for me, John. You know that under pressure, your faith life is forced into the open and shows its true colors. Difficult circumstances develops the main character. It's what happens in a good story. It's what happens in your life. There are things that I've gone through that I just want to shake my head and say, God, why are you doing this? But then I look back and say, God, now I get it. It's kind of like a story that I heard about this old man. He's from East Tennessee. He's just mean as a snake, mean as a cuss. He's just mean, mean, mean. He had 3 boys, Sam, Jim, and John. They'd never been to church. The local church had knocked on their door, brought covered dishes, brought them bulletins, prayed for them, did everything they could to get this family in the church, but they never went to church. One day, this old man's little boy, little John, got bit by a rattlesnake. A mean rattlesnake. He got real sick, laying in bed with a fever. They called a doctor. The doctor came over and looked at little John, and the doctor said, we've got bad news. He's too far gone. There's nothing that we can do to save your boy. The only thing that you can do is pray. Well, the old man thinks to himself, well, I ain't prayed ever. Never gone to church. So he calls the preacher. The preacher shows up to his house. Preacher gets to his house. The old man's got a Bible. Jim's got a Bible. Sam's got a Bible. And John's laying in bed with a fever, looking awful. The preacher gets up, finds out what's going on, and the preacher begins to say a prayer, and the prayer goes something like this. It says, Dear God, I'm here at this house of this family that have rejected you time and time again. I've knocked on their door, I've prayed for them, I've sent them Bibles, and they keep rejecting you. Dear God, I know that John has been bit by a snake. And Lord, right now, at this very moment, there's more religion in this house than there ever has been. So I ask you to send another snake to bite Jim on the hand. And I ask you to send another snake to bite Sam. and ask you to send a particular mean, nasty snake to bite this old man. God, what we need in this house are bigger and badder and meaner rattlesnakes. So the point of the story was that, y'all are supposed to laugh at that joke, okay. But the point of the story was that we want God to produce things that we want Him to do, instead of God producing things He should do. You know, that's what makes a good story. It's the hard chapters that develop the main character. And then finally, a great story has an author that can edit the story. Don't know about y'all, but a lot of us would rather have Jesus as a Savior instead of Jesus as the author. Jesus wants to take our story and He wants to edit it. He wants to say, you have a chance to use these hard chapters, these trials, these problems, and use it as a pulpit, not as a chance to have a pity party. Our story is not the main story. Our story is part of God's story. And God's story isn't to make us happy. God's story is to save the world. Amen? And so a great story has an author that can edit the story. In fact, the ending for our story has a storybook ending, right? I mean, it just doesn't get any better than the story that we're in. I want to show you a picture of a man as we close. You probably do not know who this is. His name is Michael Judge. Michael Judge is a Franciscan priest in New York City. He was also the chaplain of the New York Fire Department. He would go and he would pray for people with the fires. He would be at the scene. He would pray with the firemen. He was always involved in people's lives in New York. And on that fateful day, on 9/11, Michael Judge went running down to where the trade centers were, and he got there and he met the mayor, Rudy Giuliani. And the Mayor Rudy was telling him everything that was going on. Michael Judge started praying for people as they were brought out of the trade center. He started ministering to people. He was praying with the fire department. And then all of a sudden, for some reason, Michael Judge took off. And he took off running right into the middle of the trade center. He goes into the trade center and he begins to find people that he can help. He begins to find people that he can minister to. He begins to find the people that are about to die to say the last prayer with them. One last prayer for the people who were burning to death. This preacher, this priest, runs into the middle of the storm. And then this picture came out. Michael Judge was victim number 0001. He was the first person pronounced dead at 9/11. They dragged his dead body out of the trade center to the medical examiner. And he was dead, the first victim. Now, the story takes a twist. As they begin to search Michael Judge's body, they find an old crumpled up piece of paper, and on it is written this. Michael Judge had written this prayer, which is now on his tombstone. It says this, I don't know if you can read it, but it says, Lord, take me where you want me to go. Let me meet who you want me to meet. Tell me what you want me to say, and keep me out of your way. That was a man that knew that God was bigger than his present. He knew that his story, even though it took twists and turns, was being used as a pulpit to help people. He died saying prayers for other people. So this morning, I want to encourage you that right now, whatever you're going through, whether it's surgery, whether it's a broken home, whether it's addiction, whether it's declining health, whether it's financial stress, whatever it is, I want to tell you that God is bigger than your present. I know that because the good book said so. We're going to offer a chance for an invitation today. If you need prayers for something that's difficult, we want you to come forward. If it's a difficult circumstance, if it's a valley that you're in, if it's a dark moment, we want you to come. Because I do know this. We all have this in common. You have either just come out of a hard chapter, you're either in the middle of a hard chapter, or you're about to turn the page into a hard chapter. But no matter where you are, God is bigger than your present. If there's anything we can do, we want to pray with you. We want to listen to you. We want to encourage you. We will cry with you. Please come to the front. We stand and sing.